Let's get started. Story number 1.
It had been a long day. Sarah had just moved into her new apartment, an old 3-story building that had been converted into several units. She had spent the day hauling boxes up the narrow stairs, sorting through her belongings and settling in. It was the kind of apartment she had dreamed of for years. Spacious, affordable, and in a quiet part of town. Her friends had warned her that the building was a little older than most, but she didn't mind. She had grown up in an old house and found comfort in the creaks and groans of aging buildings. The apartment itself was charming. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, and a large window that looked out over the street. Sarah loved it at first sight. There were a few quirks, like the odd smell in the hallway and the fact that the apartment door would occasionally stick, but nothing that seemed worth worrying about. It was the perfect space to start fresh. The first night, Sarah went to bed early. She was exhausted, her body sore from lifting boxes all day. She fell asleep quickly, the sound of the city's distant hum lulling her into a deep sleep. Around 3 a.m., she was jolted awake. It wasn't a noise or a bang, but rather a sensation like someone was watching her. She sat up in bed, heart pounding. The room was dark, but moonlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. She glanced at the clock, 3:12 a.m. Something about the stillness of the apartment unsettled her. It was too quiet, unnaturally quiet, like the air had been sucked out of the room. She lay back down, trying to shake off the feeling, but the unease lingered. She rolled over and pulled the covers tighter around her shoulders. That was when she heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from somewhere in the apartment. It was soft, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder, like something or someone was dragging its nails across the wall. Sarah's heart raced. She sat up again, straining to listen. The scratching continued, rhythmic and persistent, coming from the far corner of the room. Slowly, she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up. The apartment felt cold, a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She walked cautiously toward the corner, where the scratching noise had been coming from. She turned on the light switch, but the bulb flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. There was nothing there. The corner was empty. Puzzled, Sarah checked the rest of the apartment, kitchen, bathroom, and hallway, but everything seemed normal. She returned to the bedroom and double-checked the window. It was locked and the blinds were drawn. Still, the feeling of being watched remained, pressing in on her chest. She tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination. Maybe the walls were settling or the building was making noises. She climbed back into bed, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread that had taken hold of her. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually exhaustion won out, and she drifted off again. The next morning, Sarah decided to go out and grab some coffee. She needed to get some fresh air and clear her mind. As she walked down the street, she couldn't help but notice that the building looked even older during the daylight. Its faded bricks and cracked windows seemed to tell a story of neglect. She had only noticed the beauty of the apartment last night, but now, under the harsh light of the morning, the cracks and peeling paint stood out. When she returned later in the day, the unease in her chest had settled somewhat. She unpacked a few more boxes and rearranged her things. But that night, as she lay in bed, the scratching sound returned. This time it was louder, more frantic, like fingernails scraping across the floor right beneath her bed. Her heart skipped a beat, and she sat up, scanning the room. The air felt thick again, like something was wrong. She reached for the light, but the bulb flickered and buzzed before going out completely. Her pulse quickened, and she fumbled for her phone, using its screen as a flashlight. The room was still empty, but the scratching continued, louder now, almost as if it was coming from beneath the floorboards. It sounded like something was trying to claw its way up through the wood. Sarah's mind raced. It couldn't be rats. There was no way. The building was old, but it was well maintained. But the sound, it was too real, too deliberate. She stood up and grabbed the broom from the closet, her hand shaking. She tapped it against the floor, trying to silence the noise. But the scratching only grew louder in response. Her thoughts spun in a whirlwind, but her feet moved on their own. She rushed out of the bedroom and into the hallway, where she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The apartment door, which she was sure she had locked, was now slightly ajar. The air in the hallway felt cold, and the hallway light flickered as if something was pulling at the electricity. The scratching grew more frantic, echoing in the empty hallway. Sarah felt her knees buckle. She was scared now, genuinely scared. She stepped forward, pushing open the door to the building's stairwell and looked down into the darkness below. The hallway was completely empty, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw something that made her freeze in place. On the wall of the stairwell, scrawled in what looked like black ink, was a symbol. A crude, twisted shape, two intersecting lines with a circle in the center. It wasn't just on the wall either. It had been scratched into the wood of the doorframe as if something or someone had tried to carve it into the building itself. Her stomach turned, and the scratching intensified again, this time from directly below her in the stairwell. She turned and ran back into her apartment, slamming the door behind her and locking it tight. She sank to the floor, gasping for air, her hands trembling. The next day, Sarah called the landlord, her voice unsteady as she described the strange noises and the symbol she had seen. The landlord was a middle-aged man named George, and when he arrived that afternoon, he didn't look surprised. "I've had some complaints," he said, "but nothing like what you're describing. The building's old, and we've had some tenants come and go over the years, but no one's ever mentioned anything like that." Sarah explained what she had seen and heard, her voice shaking as she recounted the strange happenings. George listened, nodding occasionally, but when she mentioned the symbol in the stairwell, his face paled. That's not just a coincidence," he said quietly, his voice low. "That's something more." Sarah's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" George hesitated before speaking again. "This building used to be a hospital a long time ago, a mental institution. They shut it down after some terrible things happened. Some of the staff and patients died under suspicious circumstances. People said the place was haunted." Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine. "You never told me that when I signed the lease," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't think it was necessary," George replied. "The building's been remodeled and it's mostly quiet now. But I think you might have encountered something that's been waiting." "I don't know if I can stay here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "What should I do?" George looked at her, his eyes troubled. "I'll have someone come by to cleanse the place. It's the only thing we can do. But you should think about it. If things keep getting worse, maybe it's time to leave." Sarah didn't need any more convincing. She packed her things and left that very night. She never returned to the apartment, and she never heard from George again. Later, she learned that the building had been sold to new owners, and the tenants who moved in after her reported similar experiences. The strange scratching, the feeling of being watched, and the unsettling whispers at night. No one ever stayed in the apartment for long. Sarah moved to a new place, one in a modern building with no history and no mysteries. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind howls through the streets, she still hears the faintest sound of scratching coming from somewhere deep within the walls. Story the end.
Story number 2.
When I moved into my new apartment, I thought it would be the perfect fresh start. After a bad breakup and a long stretch of couch surfing, I finally had a place to call my own. The apartment was in an old building, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, but still close to everything I needed. It wasn't glamorous, but the rent was reasonable and the space was perfect for one person. The hardwood floors creaked and the windows had a draft, but it had character. It felt like home, at least at first. The first night was uneventful. I was so tired from moving in that I went straight to bed. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The apartment felt too silent, too still. I pushed it out of my mind, telling myself it was just my imagination. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator, and eventually sleep overtook me. It wasn't until a few days later that I started to notice strange things happening. The first incident occurred in the middle of the night. I woke up to the sound of something tapping on my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe my neighbors moving around, but the tapping grew louder and more insistent. It wasn't a knock, it was more like a gentle scratching, as if someone was running their fingers across the wood. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, straining to listen. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it had started. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to get up and check. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek out into the hallway, but there was nothing there. No one. I thought I was just tired and imagining things. I convinced myself that the old building just made weird noises. But as the days went by, the strange occurrences continued. I began hearing faint whispers late at night. They were barely audible, like someone was talking just out of earshot. I would sit up in bed, my body tense, but no one was ever there when I looked. Sometimes I would hear footsteps in the hallway, heavy and slow, like someone was walking around in boots. But when I opened my door, the hallway would be empty. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned to the apartment to find something even more unsettling. A chair in my kitchen was turned completely around, facing the opposite direction from where I had left it. It wasn't just moved a little, it was positioned like someone had sat down and spun it around deliberately. I stood in the doorway, staring at the chair, my stomach dropping. I was certain I hadn't touched it. I even checked the windows, thinking maybe a gust of wind had done it, but everything was sealed tight. My mind raced as I tried to come up with a logical explanation, but I couldn't find one. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, it all felt too loud, too intrusive. I kept hearing footsteps again, but this time they seemed to be coming from directly beneath me. I felt my pulse quicken. I lived on the 3rd floor, and the building was old, so maybe it was just the other tenants moving around. But the more I listened, the more the footsteps seemed wrong, too slow, too deliberate. And when they stopped, I could swear I heard a soft, raspy breathing, like someone was standing just below my floor, waiting. I tried to ignore it, but my anxiety was mounting. I had to do something. So I went to the landlord the next morning, hoping to get some answers. When I asked if there had been any strange reports or rumors about the apartment, she looked at me for a moment, her expression unreadable. "No," she said, shaking her head. "Nothing unusual. It's an old building, though. Sometimes the pipes make noises, or the floors creak. That's all. People have lived here for years without any issues." I didn't press her further. Maybe I was just being paranoid, I thought, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. The next night, I decided to stay up later than usual just to see if I could catch whatever it was that was making the noises. I sat in the dark, listening to the sounds of the apartment settling, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the occasional noise from the outside street. But then, I heard something else. It was the sound of a door opening, soft, almost imperceptible. My heart stopped. I hadn't moved from the couch. The door to my bedroom was still closed. I froze, straining to hear more. The door creaked open a little more, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Not in the hallway, but inside my apartment. They were slow, hesitant, like someone was unsure of where they were going. They got closer, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room, but I didn't hear a door open. There was no one in the hallway. I slowly stood up, my legs shaking. I walked to the door of my bedroom, but there was nothing. The apartment was still, the air thick with silence. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed on the couch, wide awake, staring at the dark corners of the room, waiting for something to happen. But the night passed without incident. The next day, I went out for a while. I had determined to clear my head. When I returned, I found another strange thing waiting for me. The bathroom mirror was fogged up, despite the fact that no one had been in there for hours. The condensation had formed strange, swirling patterns on the glass, and in the middle of the fog, there was a word scrawled in the mist. "Help!" I gasped, my blood running cold. There was no way this could be a coincidence. No way it was just the result of steam or moisture. I wiped the mirror, but the word didn't disappear. It stayed, imprinted in the fog. At that point, I couldn't pretend anymore. I had to face the truth. This apartment was haunted. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure if it was the ghost of someone who had lived there before or if something had happened in the building years ago, but I knew I had to do something to make it stop. I reached out to a friend who had some experience with the paranormal, and she agreed to come over to help. She arrived that evening, bringing with her a few simple tools: a candle, a piece of sage, and a small prayer book. We sat in the living room, and she asked me to recount everything that had happened since I moved in. As I spoke, she nodded, her face serious. "There's something here," she said softly, "but we can remove it. We just need to make sure it knows it's not welcome." We went through the apartment, starting in the living room. My friend lit the candle and began to chant softly, her voice steady and calm. She moved from room to room, waving the sage through the air, speaking words I couldn't understand. The whole process took over an hour, and by the end of it, I could feel a shift in the air. The apartment didn't feel as heavy. It felt clearer somehow. We sat down on the couch afterward, and she smiled at me. "You should be fine now," she said. "Whatever it was, it's gone." I didn't know if I fully believed it, but I thanked her and walked her out. The rest of the night was quiet. No footsteps, no whispers, no strange movements. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. I don't know what happened in that apartment. Maybe it was the building settling, or maybe something had followed me in. But after my friend's cleansing, the apartment felt different. Safer, even. The feeling of being watched faded, and the strange noises stopped. I still don't know who or what was there with me, but I'm grateful it's gone. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I had just moved to the city, fresh out of college, ready to start a new chapter in my life. The transition was tough, leaving behind everything I knew and loved, but the excitement of being on my own kept me going. After a few weeks of searching, I found an apartment that seemed perfect. It was small but cozy, tucked away in a quiet building in a neighborhood that felt safe and welcoming. The rent was affordable, and I could see myself settling in there for a while. I signed the lease and made arrangements to move in the following weekend. The building itself was an old one, with high ceilings and wooden floors that creaked beneath your feet. It had charm, sure, but there was also a wariness to it. Faded wallpaper, cracked windows, and the kind of narrow hallways that always smelled faintly of dust. Still, the apartment itself was lovely. The living room had a large bay window that let in natural light, and the kitchen had been recently renovated. The bedroom was small but comfortable, and I was excited to make it my own. On my first night, I unpacked a few boxes and set up the essentials: a couch, a bed, some kitchenware. I didn't have much, but it was enough to get me started. The apartment felt peaceful, and after the chaos of the move, I relished the silence. I ordered takeout, watched some TV, and then decided to get some rest. But that night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I began to feel uneasy. It was as though something was in the room with me, watching me. The air felt heavy, charged, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just the newness of the apartment, the unfamiliarity of the space. I turned over, closed my eyes, and tried to sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise. It was faint at first, just a creak, like a floorboard shifting. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the building settling. But then I heard it again, a scraping sound, soft but unmistakable. It sounded like something or someone was moving around in the hallway outside my door. I held my breath, listening, and for a moment everything was silent. Then a soft tapping. Tap, tap, tap. My heart raced. I had no idea what it was. I tried to convince myself it was just the house making noise. Pipes, the wind, anything but what it felt like. Someone walking down the hallway, tapping on the door. I got out of bed, walked to the door, and peeked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked the locks, double-checked the windows, and returned to bed, but the tapping didn't stop. It was relentless, soft yet insistent, as if someone or something was just beyond the door, waiting. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. It must have been the house settling, or maybe some strange noise from the building's plumbing, but the unease lingered. I tried to focus on work, unpacked a few more boxes, and went about my day. But when night fell, the creeping dread returned. The tapping began again, the moment the clock struck 2 a.m. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder this time, more deliberate. I got up and looked through the peephole again, but once again there was no one in the hallway. My heart raced. I didn't know what to make of it, but I was scared. Scared of the noise, scared of the way the apartment seemed to come alive at night. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was nothing, just an old building making noises. But the fear was hard to shake. The third night, the tapping was joined by something else, a soft rustling sound like fabric brushing against the floor. I felt my pulse quicken. I didn't want to investigate, but I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, slowly making my way to the door. The hallway was quiet, empty as always. But as I stood there, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, I noticed something strange. The doormat in front of my door, normally straight and flat, was askew, as if someone had kicked it or dragged it. I bent down to straighten it, and that's when I saw it, a small piece of paper wedged underneath. I pulled it out, my hands trembling, and unfolded it. It was a note written in a hurried, scrawled hand. "Get out." My breath caught in my throat. The words seemed to burn into my mind. I stood frozen, staring at the note in my hand. How had it gotten there? The door had been locked, and I had heard no one outside. It didn't make sense. The note felt wrong, like a warning that I couldn't ignore. That night, the tapping was louder, more frantic. I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing it, that unmistakable sound of something dragging, tapping, scraping against the floor. The apartment felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in just a few hours. The silence between each tap was unbearable, and I was convinced that something, or someone, was out there, watching. The next day, I decided to call the landlord. Her name was Mrs. Roberts, and she had been kind enough when I moved in. I wasn't sure if I should mention the note or the strange noises, but I needed to know more about the apartment. Mrs. Roberts answered the phone on the second ring. "Hello. Hi, Mrs. Roberts," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's Sarah from apartment 3B. I was wondering if you could tell me more about the history of the building." There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear her breathing. "Why do you want to know?" she asked, her voice suddenly cautious. "I've just been hearing some strange noises at night," I said, trying to keep the conversation light. "And I found this note outside my door last night. It just said, 'Get out. I'm a little concerned.'" Another long pause. I didn't think it would happen again," Mrs. Roberts said, her voice trembling now. "Look, I didn't want to scare you, but I need to be honest with you. The building has a history. The last tenant of your apartment, she died here. She was found in the bedroom, alone. No one knows exactly how, but some people say she never left. Some say her spirit still lingers, and, well, it seems like you're experiencing what she did." My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Roberts continued. "I should have told you before you moved in, but I thought you might be okay. Just be careful, Sarah. I can't promise you won't hear the noises again." I hung up the phone, my mind reeling. The last tenant? The one who had died in my apartment? I felt sick to my stomach. Could that really be why the noises were happening? Why I felt like I wasn't alone in the apartment? That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the bedroom. I stayed on the couch, clutching my phone for comfort. The tapping started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a tapping. It was a full-on scraping sound, like fingernails dragging slowly across the floor, coming closer and closer to the couch. I could hear it getting louder, as though whatever was making the noise was moving through the apartment toward me. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified, paralyzed with fear. My eyes darted around the room, scanning for any sign of movement, any sign that I wasn't alone. The temperature in the room dropped even more, and I could see my breath in the air. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint but clear, coming from the corner of the room. "Get out." I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I backed away slowly, my eyes wide, and I could feel the presence of someone, watching me. In that moment, I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't live in that apartment, not with the constant fear and the strange sounds. I packed my things in a hurry, not caring if I left something behind. I didn't even turn off the lights. I just ran. I never went back to that apartment. I moved to a different building, far away from the one that haunted me. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my new place, I still hear the faint tapping, the scraping. It's distant, but it's there, and I know it's not my imagination. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
It had been a long search for her new place, but finally, Abby had found it. A charming little apartment on the edge of the city. The rent was affordable, and it seemed to be exactly what she needed. A fresh start, after a difficult few months. The building was old, but not in the way that made you feel uncomfortable. The moment Abby stepped into the unit, she knew it was the one. High ceilings, large windows, and a view of the tree-lined street. It was the perfect space for her to start over. She signed the lease without hesitation, eager to move in. The landlord, Mrs. Farrell, was a kind, older woman with a gentle smile and a welcoming manner. She gave Abby the tour of the building, explaining that the unit had just been renovated. It had been vacant for a while, she told her, and Abby was the first tenant in months. The first night was uneventful. Abby unpacked her belongings, made a quick dinner, and settled into the new apartment. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but the quiet and peacefulness of the place felt good. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe and content. She turned off the lights and crawled into bed, hoping to get a full night's sleep. But as she lay there in the dark, Abby began to feel an odd sensation, a sense that she was being watched. She sat up, listening intently, but the apartment was still. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the street below. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was just the newness of the place. It was her imagination running wild. She pulled the blankets back over her shoulders and tried to sleep again. But then came the sound, soft at first, like a tapping, barely audible. It started from somewhere behind her, and Abby tensed. She listened more carefully, trying to make sense of it. The tapping continued for a few moments before it stopped abruptly. She held her breath, waiting, but the room remained still. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, a stray branch tapping against the window, maybe, or the building settling. But the unsettling sensation lingered, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, she decided to get up and check the apartment, hoping to put her fears to rest. She switched on the light and walked from room to room. Everything was exactly as it should be. The windows were closed, the doors locked, and there were no signs of anything out of place. But the feeling of unease refused to leave her. She eventually crawled back into bed, trying to sleep, but it was a long time before she could drift off. When she finally did, she was restless, tossing and turning, plagued by vivid dreams. It was as though the apartment itself was alive, pressing in on her. The next few nights were more of the same. The tapping sound, always in the dead of night, would return. It wasn't loud or intrusive, but it was persistent, and it always seemed to come from the same spot, a corner of the living room near the window. Abby would lie in bed, heart racing, straining to hear where the sound was coming from. When she finally gathered the courage to get up and investigate, there was nothing there. The corner was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched never left her. It was as if something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to notice. A week into her time in the apartment, the strange occurrences escalated. Abby was sitting in the living room one evening, reading a book, when she heard something behind her. Light footsteps, soft but unmistakable. She turned around, her heart pounding, but there was no one there. She stood up, glancing around the room, and once again, everything seemed fine. She was alone, but as she turned back to her chair, she noticed something odd. The book she had been reading was now lying face down on the floor, several feet away from where she had left it. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. The room was empty, but she was no longer alone. She picked up the book and stared at it for a moment before placing it back on the table. She couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. What was in her apartment? The next morning, she mentioned the strange events to Mrs. Farrell, her landlord. She tried to remain casual, not wanting to sound like she was overreacting, but Mrs. Farrell's expression darkened when she heard about the tapping noises in the book. "Oh, dear," Mrs. Farrell said, her voice soft. "I was hoping you wouldn't experience anything like that. This apartment has a history." Abby's eyebrows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "It's been vacant for a while, like I said," Mrs. Farrell continued. "Before that, there was a tenant here, a woman named Clara. She was a lovely person, but she died in the apartment unexpectedly. It was about a year ago now. Heart attack, I believe. The police found her one morning, still in bed. No one really knows why. It was so sudden. Her family never came to claim her things, and the apartment has been empty ever since." Abby was silent for a moment, absorbing what Mrs. Farrell had said. She hadn't heard anything about a death when she first moved in. The building had seemed so quiet, so normal, but now, with Mrs. Farrell's words hanging in the air, it felt different. The tapping, the unease, it all seemed to be adding up to something more sinister. "I'm sure you're just experiencing the usual noises of an old building," Mrs. Farrell added quickly. "But if you ever feel uncomfortable, don't hesitate to come to me. I'll help you out." Abby nodded, but didn't feel reassured. The thought of Clara, the woman who had died in the apartment, lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's presence was somehow still there, in the apartment, watching her. That night, when the tapping started again, Abby didn't try to investigate. She stayed in bed, her eyes wide open in the dark, hoping that somehow the noises would stop. The next few nights were unbearable. The tapping grew louder, as if whatever was causing it was moving closer. It sounded like fingers, nails scraping across the floor, deliberately, slowly, as if trying to get her attention. Abby couldn't ignore it anymore. She was terrified. The apartment felt more oppressive, the air thick with an invisible weight. She couldn't stay there any longer. The final straw came one evening when Abby was sitting in the living room watching TV. The air was suddenly freezing, colder than usual for a warm spring evening. She shivered, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, but the cold wouldn't go away. And then, from behind her, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, clear as day, walking across the floor. Abby turned around in shock, but there was no one there. That was when she saw it, something she had missed before. The corner of the living room, near the window, was shadowed in an unnatural way, as though the light in the room couldn't quite reach it. Abby's breath caught in her throat as she watched the shadow shift, move, and then slowly start to take shape. It was an indistinct figure, almost translucent, but Abby could make out the outline of a person, a woman, hunched, staring at her. The fear was instant and overwhelming. Abby jumped to her feet, backing away from the shadow, but it seemed to follow her, growing larger, closer. She turned and ran to the door, nearly stumbling in her haste to get out. She didn't even bother to grab her coat. She just needed to get out of that apartment. Once she was outside, she stood on the sidewalk, gasping for breath, her heart racing. She called Mrs. Farrell, her voice shaky, and explained what had just happened. Mrs. Farrell was quiet for a long time before responding. "I should have warned you," she said softly. "Clara's death was no accident. People say she still haunts the apartment. She's not at peace." Abby didn't know what to say. She had to get out, and she wasn't going back to that apartment. She stayed with a friend that night, and the next day, she made arrangements to move out. She couldn't stay in a place with such a dark history, not when the fear was too real. When she finally left for good, she never looked back. The apartment stayed vacant for months, and when new tenants moved in, Abby's curiosity led her to check in. They had moved out just as quickly as she had, and when the landlord asked if she knew anything about why the place was so unsettling, she could only shake her head. Some things, she thought, are better left in the past. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It had been a long search, but after weeks of scrolling through listings, touring overcrowded apartments, and dealing with dead ends, Emily finally found the perfect place. The building was older, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, but it was beautiful in its own way. The hardwood floors creaked with character, the high ceilings gave the space a feeling of openness, and the rent was affordable. The moment Emily walked in, she knew this was it, the apartment she'd been looking for. It was small but cozy, with a large living room, a cute little kitchen, and a bedroom that was just the right size. The building itself was old, an early 20th century walk-up with brass fixtures, faded wallpaper, and narrow hallways that always smelled faintly of dust and wood polish. The landlord, Mr. Hawthorne, was an elderly man with a gentle demeanor who spoke in a soft, slow voice, but there was something oddly reassuring about him. He told her that the apartment had recently been renovated, but that the building itself had been around for decades. Emily didn't mind. She loved the charm of older buildings, and after all, the apartment was perfect. She signed the lease and moved in a few days later. The first night was peaceful. The apartment was quiet, far away from the bustling city noise she had grown used to. She unpacked her boxes, arranged her things, and even took the time to decorate the place with some plants and artwork she had accumulated over the years. She finished her evening with a hot bath and a cup of tea, settling down into bed, ready for a good night's sleep. But that night, something strange happened. Around 2:30 in the morning, Emily woke up to a faint sound. It was like a soft thud coming from the hallway outside her bedroom. She paused, straining her ears to listen. It was quiet again. Maybe it was just the building settling, she thought. The walls were thin, after all, and old buildings had a way of creaking and groaning. She tried to go back to sleep, but then there was another noise, this time a distinct scraping sound, like something was being dragged across the floor. Her eyes snapped open and she sat up in bed, her heart racing. The sound was coming from the hallway again, but it was soft and steady, like the dragging of a heavy object. Emily held her breath and listened, her pulse quickening. She couldn't move, frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Her mind raced, wondering if someone had broken into the building or if there was a simple explanation, pipes rattling, the sound of wind through the old windows, but none of that felt right. The sound was too deliberate, too constant. The scraping continued for several minutes, and then it stopped. Emily's breath was shallow as she tried to shake the unease from her mind. After a long pause, she mustered the courage to get up. She grabbed her phone off the nightstand and turned on the flashlight. Stepping out into the hallway, she crept slowly toward the source of the sound. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty. The faint smell of dust lingered in the air, but otherwise, everything was still. She felt a chill run through her as she walked back to her bedroom. She locked the door behind her and crawled back into bed, trying to shake off the strange experience. Maybe she had imagined it, she thought, or maybe it was the wind. But something about the sound lingered in her mind. The next morning, Emily chalked it up to an overactive imagination. She had just moved in, after all, and the stress of the move could have played tricks on her. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few days, the strange noises continued. The scraping sounds returned every night at around the same time, around 2:30 a.m., and Emily began to feel a constant sense of unease. At first, she tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was just the house settling or some random noise from her neighbors, but it didn't feel like a simple creak or groan from the old building. It felt intentional, like someone or something was deliberately making the noise. One evening, after hearing the noise again, Emily decided to investigate further. She didn't know why, but she felt a strange compulsion to figure out what was going on. She pulled on a sweater and padded quietly into the hallway, her flashlight in hand. This time, she was determined to get to the bottom of it. As she approached the source of the noise, she froze. The door to the apartment directly across from hers was slightly ajar and a faint light seeped out from the crack. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen anyone come or go from that apartment. The hallway was always silent and no one had ever been around when she arrived or left. The scraping noise was louder now. It was coming from inside the apartment, unmistakably. Emily hesitated. She had no reason to believe anything sinister was going on, but the feeling in the pit of her stomach told her otherwise. She reached for the door handle, but before she could open it, the door creaked slightly, as if someone was on the other side. "Hello?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "Is anyone there?" There was no response, only the soft sound of shuffling inside the apartment. She backed away, a feeling of dread settling over her. She turned and rushed back to her apartment, locking the door behind her. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she tried to calm herself down. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe it was the neighbors moving furniture. But something told her it wasn't. The next morning, Emily decided to go down to the building's superintendent's office to ask about the strange noises. She hadn't seen anyone in the building besides Mr. Hawthorne, and she needed answers. She found the superintendent, an older man named Ralph, sitting behind a small desk near the building's entrance. "Excuse me, Ralph, I've been hearing some strange noises at night. Scraping sounds, like something dragging on the floor. Do you know if anyone else has experienced anything like that?" Emily asked, her voice hesitant. Ralph's expression faltered. For a moment, he looked down at his desk, his fingers tapping nervously on the wood. When he looked up at her again, his eyes were guarded. "Yeah, I've heard things like that from time to time," he said, his voice low. "But I wouldn't worry about it. Old buildings make noises, especially at night. You just got to get used to it. Emily wasn't convinced. She pressed on, asking about the apartment across the hall from hers, the one where she had heard the noises coming from. Ralph's face went pale. He looked around as if making sure no one else was listening. That apartment, it's been vacant for years. The previous tenant died there in the middle of the night. No one ever figured out what happened to her. Emily's stomach churned. What do you mean? How did she die? Ralph hesitated. She died. Suddenly. They say she was alone, just living her life in that apartment, but one night there was a lot of noise coming from there. The neighbors complained about scratching sounds, scraping. Some people said it sounded like something was being dragged across the floor. When the police arrived, they found her in the apartment, but it was like she had just no sign of a struggle, nothing. They say her spirit never left. Emily's heart sank. She felt her knees weaken. You're telling me that apartment is haunted? Ralph didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The noises had stopped, but the chill of fear lingered in her bones. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she heard it again. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, then louder and more deliberate. The scraping sound, like nails on the floor. It was coming from the apartment across the hall. Emily had no idea what to do. She was trapped in a place she couldn't leave. She could hear the sound getting closer, dragging toward her own door. It felt as though the thing was moving toward her, slow and steady, making its way across the hallway toward her. Her heart pounded in her chest. The door to her apartment rattled, just slightly, as though someone was trying to push it open. Emily sat up in bed, too terrified to move, and then the door creaked open. But when she turned on the light and looked, there was nothing there. No one in the hallway, no one outside her door. Just silence. But deep down, Emily knew. She knew that the sounds, the scraping, weren't just random noises. They were something much darker. The apartment had a past, and it seemed as though that past had found her. The next day, Emily packed her things and left. She never went back to that apartment. But some nights, when she's alone in a new place, she still hears the faintest scratching sound dragging its way across the floor. Story the end.
Story number 6.
When I moved into the new apartment, it felt like a fresh start. I had just broken up with my long-term boyfriend, and I needed a place to regroup and find myself. The apartment was small, but it had big windows that let in the sunlight, and it was in a quiet neighborhood, away from the bustle of city life. I liked it immediately and signed the lease without hesitation. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking boxes and getting to know the area. The apartment was on the second floor of an old building, and while the hallways smelled a bit musty, it had character. There were creaky floors, wooden beams in the ceilings, and large old-fashioned radiators that clanged and hissed when they warmed up. It was charming in a way, though sometimes the sounds felt a bit unsettling, like the building was alive, creaking under the weight of its own history. It was the third night that things started to get strange. I had just finished dinner and was sitting on the couch reading a book when I heard a noise coming from the hallway. It was faint at first, just a soft tapping sound, like someone was lightly knocking on my door. I frowned, confused. I wasn't expecting anyone. The tapping stopped, and I thought maybe it had been the neighbors or maybe just the building settling. I went back to my book, but the sound returned. Louder this time. More like a scratch, as if someone was gently running their fingers along the wood. I put the book down and stood up. My heart was pounding a little faster now. I walked to the door and hesitated. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but when I opened it, there was nothing. The hallway was empty. The dim light from the stairwell flickered, casting shadows on the walls, but no one was there. I closed the door and shook my head. I must have imagined it, I thought. Maybe I was just tired. I returned to the couch, but the feeling of unease lingered. The apartment felt colder somehow, and the silence in the room was thick, oppressive. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the building seemed amplified, and I kept hearing strange noises from the hallway. At one point, I even thought I heard someone whispering, so faint that I couldn't make out the words, but distinct enough to send a chill down my spine. I got up and checked the hallway again, but it was still empty. I told myself it was just the building. It was old, after all. Maybe there were rats in the walls or just the usual noises that old places made. I managed to fall asleep eventually, though fitfully. The next day, I was still feeling on edge. I tried to go about my routine, but something felt off. When I went to the kitchen, I found that a cup I'd left drying on the counter was now moved. It wasn't just a little out of place. It was completely turned around, as if someone had picked it up and placed it there deliberately. I couldn't understand how it happened. I was sure I had left it in a different spot. That evening, I decided to go out for a walk to clear my head. I passed by the building's entrance and noticed an elderly woman sitting on the bench outside. She looked familiar, though I couldn't place her. She was bundled up in a thick scarf, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the ground. As I walked past, she looked up and gave me a long, steady look. Her eyes were wide and unblinking. "You're in apartment 203, aren't you?" she asked, her voice raspy but calm. I stopped, startled. Yes, I am," I said, unsure how she knew. "Do you live here too?" She smiled a little, but there was no warmth in it. "I used to," she said cryptically. "You should be careful in that apartment. It's not empty." I frowned, not sure how to respond. I didn't know if she was just an eccentric old woman or if she was trying to warn me about something. Before I could ask more, she turned away, her attention already back on the ground. I didn't give her words much thought at the time. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started noticing more strange things around the apartment. The lights would flicker, and I began hearing whispers again, but this time they were clearer, like they were coming from just behind me. I could swear that sometimes when I turned around quickly, I'd catch a glimpse of something, movement in the corner of my vision, a shadow darting past, or a door slightly ajar when I knew I had closed it. I even thought I saw the bathroom mirror fog up one morning, though no one had used the shower. Then came the night I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had just come home from work, and as I entered my apartment, the first thing I noticed was that the lights in the living room were off. I was certain I'd left them on when I left in the morning. I had no reason to doubt it. The thought made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb was burned out. I sighed, walking toward the hallway to check the fuse box. The air in the hallway felt different, colder than the rest of the apartment, like the temperature had dropped several degrees. I shivered as I passed the bathroom door. The door was slightly open, and I could see the faint outline of something in the mirror. I walked closer, my heart thumping in my chest. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. There, reflected in the mirror, was a figure standing behind me. It was just a silhouette, but I could make out the outline of a person, tall and thin, their face a blur of shadows. I whirled around, but there was nothing behind me. The hallway was empty. I turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. I couldn't breathe. The oppressive silence in the apartment felt suffocating, and I had to get out. I grabbed my coat and ran down the stairs to the lobby, my heart racing. The elderly woman's warning echoed in my mind. It's not empty. I spent the night at a friend's place, and the next morning I went to the landlord to ask about the history of the apartment. She seemed surprised by my questions and told me there was nothing unusual about the building. But something about her face, the hesitation in her voice, made me doubt that. I pressed her more, asking about the previous tenants, but she just told me that the last person had moved out a few months ago. She couldn't remember anything specific about them. That night, I decided to dig deeper. I spent hours on the internet, searching through old records and newspapers, looking for anything that might explain the strange occurrences. It didn't take long for me to find something. The building had a dark past. Years ago, a young couple had lived in apartment 203. They were both found dead in the apartment under mysterious circumstances. No signs of struggle, but the police report mentioned something about strange noises and the feeling of being watched. Their deaths had never been fully explained, and rumors of haunting soon followed. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't alone in that apartment. I packed my things the next day. I couldn't stay there anymore. The feeling of being watched was too much to bear, and I wasn't willing to take any more chances. I called the landlord, told her I was leaving, and asked for my deposit back. She seemed unbothered, almost as if she had expected me to leave. As I drove away from the building, I glanced up at the second-floor window. The curtains were drawn, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from inside. I never went back to that apartment. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I had just signed the lease for my first apartment. It was a modest, one-bedroom unit on the third floor of a building that had seen better days. The building was old, with creaky floors and dimly lit hallways, but I loved it. The rent was affordable, and the location was perfect. Close to work, close to my friends. I was eager to start this new chapter of my life and excited to settle into my new space. The first few days went smoothly. I spent my time unpacking and getting familiar with the apartment. The apartment itself had a sort of charm, tall windows, old wooden floors, and vintage fixtures that gave it a cozy, almost nostalgic feel. I felt at home. But on the third night, things started to change. I was getting ready for bed when I heard something faint, like a scratching sound, almost like fingernails dragging across a surface. I paused, straining to hear it more clearly. The sound seemed to come from the kitchen, but when I checked, there was nothing there. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the old building settling or maybe the pipes making noises. Later that night, I woke up to the distinct sound of footsteps outside my bedroom door. My heart raced as I listened, frozen under the covers. The steps were slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone was walking around outside. I waited for the sound to stop, but it didn't. The footsteps continued, moving toward my door. I sat up in bed trying to quiet my breath, my body tense with fear. I didn't know what to do. Should I open the door? Should I call someone? My mind raced with possibilities, but I was too scared to move. The footsteps paused right outside my door, and for a few moments, all I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally stopped. I waited a few more moments before cautiously getting out of bed and checking the hallway. It was empty. The building was silent again, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stood in the hallway, shivering, trying to convince myself it was just a dream, or maybe my imagination had gotten the best of me. I locked the door to my bedroom and crawled back into bed, too frightened to sleep. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the strange noises, it was the overwhelming sense of being watched. Every time I walked through the apartment, I felt eyes on me. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. I tried to push it out of my mind, telling myself that I was just adjusting to the new space. But every time I sat down, every time I tried to relax, I felt the weight of someone or something lurking in the background. That night, the noises returned. This time, it wasn't just the footsteps. I heard a soft, almost imperceptible whispering, like a voice, but not clear enough to make out the words. It came from the kitchen again. My heart skipped a beat, and I got out of bed, cautiously walking toward the source of the sound. I hesitated for a moment before peering into the kitchen. The space was empty, but the whispering continued, faint and distant, as if coming from the walls themselves. I didn't know what to do. Was I just being paranoid? Was I imagining things? I convinced myself it was all in my head. But that night, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was standing in the corner of the room, waiting. My anxiety spiked, and I found myself unable to sleep. As the days passed, the incidents grew more frequent. I began to hear more noises. Footsteps in the hallway, faint whispers, the sound of doors opening and closing on their own. The apartment seemed alive with energy, but not in a good way. It felt oppressive, suffocating, as if it were haunted by something, someone. One evening, as I was sitting on the couch, I felt something cold brush past me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. I thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I was just tired. But then, I saw it. In the corner of the living room near the old bookshelf, I saw a shadow moving. It was darker than the rest of the room, a figure that seemed to shift and grow as I stared at it. I blinked and the shadow was gone, but the air felt colder now, more oppressive. I couldn't deny it any longer. The apartment was haunted. I reached out to the landlord the next day, explaining the strange occurrences I had been experiencing. He seemed unfazed, almost dismissive, as if this sort of thing happened all the time. "It's an old building," he said casually. "These things happen." I pressed him further, asking if anything had happened in the apartment before I moved in, but he wouldn't give me a straight answer. He just said that people had lived there before, but no one had ever complained about anything unusual. But I knew better. Something wasn't right. I started doing some research on the building's history. I spoke to some of the neighbors, and eventually I learned the truth. The apartment I had rented had once been the home of a man named Thomas. Thomas had lived alone in the building for years, but he had died suddenly, alone in his apartment. No one knew the exact cause of his death, but it was believed that he had suffered a heart attack in the middle of the night. Some people said that he had been sick for some time. Others claimed he was depressed, but there was one common thread in every story. Thomas had died without anyone to check on him, without anyone to notice his absence for days. As the story went, it was said that Thomas had never truly left the building. Some tenants claimed they could feel his presence, while others heard his footsteps in the hall. There were rumors that his ghost still wandered the apartment, searching for company, for someone to share the space with. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. The noises, the whispers, the cold spots in the apartment, all of it pointed to one thing. Thomas was still here. That night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting my apartment. I didn't know if it would help, but I was desperate. I sat in the living room, lights dimmed, and tried to focus. I spoke aloud, telling whatever spirit was in the apartment that I was not afraid and that I had every right to live there. I didn't know if I was just talking to myself, but it made me feel better to take control of the situation. At first, nothing happened, but then the temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath fog up in front of me, and I shivered, rubbing my arms for warmth. The air felt thick and heavy, like the room was closing in on me. And then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, whispering my name. I stood up, heart racing. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The whispering stopped. There was silence for a long moment, and then, very faintly, I heard a soft, mournful sigh. "I'm sorry," the voice said. "I didn't mean to scare you." It was Thomas's voice. I didn't know what to do. I stood there, frozen, unsure of whether to run or to stay. But something inside me told me that if I left now, it would only get worse. Instead, I spoke again. "You're not alone anymore. You can go in peace." The temperature began to rise, and the oppressive weight in the room seemed to lift. I felt the air clear, and the cold spots faded away. The voice didn't respond, but I had the distinct feeling that the presence was no longer lingering. The next few nights were quiet. No footsteps, no whispers, no cold spots. For the first time since I moved in, I felt at ease. It seemed that whatever had haunted my apartment was finally at rest. I still live in that apartment, and I haven't heard anything since that night. Every so often, I think back to the strange events that happened, and I can't help but wonder if Thomas truly did leave, or if he's still watching, just waiting for someone else to listen. Story the end.